This is the Nikon Z control ring, and if I turn it to the right, the photo gets brighter, and if I turn it to the left, the photo gets darker. But why did I choose to set up the control ring like this? And what's the correct way to use it as a photographer? The control ring was first introduced into the Nikon Z system and garnered both opposition and support from a lot of photographers, with some loving the inclusion and others not so much. And initially, I was part of the photographers that didn't really care for it so much until I learned how to use it. Because the most natural instinct with a control ring is to use it for aperture, where you turn the control ring to change the aperture like a traditional lens that has an aperture ring. However, when using it like this, I found it to be difficult to get the exact aperture I wanted, and would sometimes hit the control ring on accident and go to a completely different aperture. It was far more inconvenient than convenient until I learned what to actually program it to. Instead of setting the control ring to aperture, I instead changed it to exposure compensation. This worked out much better for a few reasons. Because in order to normally change the exposure compensation, you have to hold down the exposure comp button at the top, then turn the back dial to change the exposure compensation, which for the most part should be just fine. But when setting the control ring to exposure compensation, this takes out one less button from the equation and allows you to change the exposure much faster, since your hand tends to be on the lens whenever you're shooting anyways. And what makes this setting even more lethal is when using it with shutter priority, because when we're out in run and gun situations, we can ensure we get tack sharp photos by setting a fast shutter speed and leaving it while setting ISO to auto. And by quickly changing the exposure with the control ring, you can ensure you get the perfect exposure every time without having to worry about motion blur. I use this setup a lot when I'm out shooting street photography in particular, since there tends to be lots of high contrast scenes where I want to ensure I grab all the highlight detail without having to worry about missing the shot. This is much quicker to get the perfect exposure over having to constantly change the metering mode I'm using, especially when moving between a high contrast scene and an even one. To me, this setup excels in those run and gun situations where you don't want to be fiddling with your settings every time you want to take the perfect exposure. You can just put the camera to shutter priority and change the entire exposure with the control ring and snap the photo quickly. This can also work for something like aperture priority if you wanted to focus on your depth of field over motion blur. If you are doing this though, I would recommend going into the settings and change the ISO speed to the fastest setting, so you don't get too slow of a shutter speed. For a niche like portrait photography, this could be useful if you are more worried about what aperture you're using over the run and gun, fast action type of work. Although I prefer using exposure compensation with shutter priority in particular, you can actually do this with any auto exposure setting that you wanted to be able to change your exposure in a pinch. One other way that would be useful to use a control ring is when using ISO. For example, when shooting something like landscape photography, you can set the ISO for the control ring and turn it to change it. Because normally when changing ISO, you'd have to hold down the ISO button, then turn the back dial to change the ISO. But if you don't want to take that extra step, you can simply set the control ring to ISO, so you have each dial controlling different parts of the exposure triangle, like the aperture for the front dial, shutter speed for the back dial, the control ring for the ISO. Changing the control ring to ISO is most likely more beneficial when shooting slower niches where you can take your time, which is where landscape photography would most likely benefit from this. It just depends on what you want to do with it, and obviously you're more than welcome to set up in whatever way you like. But for me, I'll always have it set up to exposure compensation and use it with shutter priority whenever I'm in those run and gun situations. It's so nice to quickly get the perfect exposure without having to worry that you're gonna miss a shot. So let me know how you like to set up your control ring down in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear how you guys have it set up. And I also uploaded another video on my Patreon where I re-edit one of my favorite photos from 6 years ago. My editing style has changed a ton, and it was crazy to see just how much better I've gotten at editing and photography from back then. So check it out on my Patreon and become a member for more photography content. Anyways, y'all, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for experiencing the world with me today. I'll catch you guys in the next one.